For centuries, the 10 plagues of Egypt have been treated as a simple story of judgment, fear, and destruction. But what if I told you that behind each plague there is a much deeper message? What if, beyond the biblical account, there are layers of symbolism, spiritual confrontation, historical curiosity, and even theories that try to explain how all of it could have happened? Because the truth is, the plagues of Egypt were not just disasters. They were a declaration of power. When people hear about the 10 plagues of Egypt, the first image that usually comes to mind is a suffering nation, rivers turning to blood, locusts covering the land, total darkness, and, in the end, the death of the firstborn. It is one of the most powerful narratives in the entire Bible, a story that has lasted for thousands of years, retold in movies, books, sermons, and debates, and still raises the same question today. What really happened in Egypt? Were those plagues purely supernatural miracles? Could there be a historical or natural explanation behind the events? And why exactly 10 plagues? Why not 3, 5, or 20? More importantly, why does this story remain so powerful even after all this time? In today's video, we're going to take a deep dive into the 10 plagues of Egypt, understand what each one represented, uncover fascinating details almost nobody talks about, and reveal the truth behind one of the most unforgettable stories of the ancient world. And the deeper you go into this story, the more you realize it is not only about Egypt. It is about pride, power, resistance, and the moment when the impossible happens in front of a hardened heart. Everything begins in a setting of oppression. The Israelites had been enslaved in Egypt for generations. They were not simply forced laborers. They were a people crushed under a powerful empire, ruled by a pharaoh who saw himself almost like a god. Egypt, at that time, was not just any nation. It was a symbol of greatness, wealth, knowledge, architecture, military strength, and religion. It was a civilization that seemed untouchable. And it is in this very setting that Moses appears. A man with an unlikely story, raised inside Pharaoh's household, yet called by God to confront the most powerful system of his time. When Moses and Aaron stand before Pharaoh with the command, "Let my people go," the response is contempt. Pharaoh does not simply refuse. He hardens his heart. He mocks the command. He places himself above divine authority. And this is where many people miss the depth of the account. The plagues were not random punishments. There is a strong interpretation that each plague directly confronted sacred elements of Egyptian religion, as if each blow dismantled, one by one, the spiritual, political, and symbolic pillars of the empire. The first plague was the transformation of the Nile River into blood. The Nile was the lifeline of Egypt. Everything depended on it: agriculture, transportation, food, survival. The river was not merely important, it was sacred. When its waters became unusable, the message was clear. What you call the source of life is also under the authority of something greater. And here is a fascinating detail. Some modern theories suggest that an unusual bloom of red algae or stirred-up sediment could have given the water a blood-like color. But even if someone tries to explain the event naturally, the weight of the story is not only in the phenomenon itself. It is in the timing, the sequence, and the spiritual impact of what happened. The second plague was frogs. At first glance, this one might seem less terrifying, but imagine an entire country overrun by frogs, crawling into houses, bedrooms, beds, and kitchens. What was once an ordinary animal becomes a torment. And there is another interesting detail. In ancient Egypt, the frog was associated with fertility and life. Once again, a symbol that had been honored became uncomfortable, excessive, and unbearable. Then came gnats or lice, depending on the translation. The third plague is especially symbolic because it attacks the body, the skin, and daily comfort. The most refined empire of the ancient world suddenly cannot handle tiny creatures. That says a lot. Sometimes it does not take an army to bring down human arrogance. Sometimes all it takes is something that seems insignificant. The fourth plague brings swarms of flies or aggressive insects. Chaos begins to invade daily life, homes, personal space, and any sense of control. And here the biblical account begins to highlight something very interesting. At certain points, the region where the Israelites lived was not affected in the same way. This reinforces the idea of separation, as if the text is saying this was not random disorder in nature, but targeted judgment. The fifth plague strikes the livestock. Horses, cattle, sheep, camels, animals essential for the economy, transportation, and survival. When the herds die, it is not only animals that are lost. Part of the nation's stability dies with them. Egypt begins to break financially, and that is a powerful detail. The plagues do not only attack comfort, they attack the structure of power itself. In the sixth plague, painful boils and sores break out. Now the suffering becomes personal. It is no longer just in the river, the animals, or the environment. It is on the skin. It is in the body. Even the Egyptian magicians, who earlier tried to imitate some of the signs, can no longer stand their ground. This is a crucial moment in the story because it shows the point where human power begins to collapse completely in the face of what it cannot control. The seventh plague comes as a devastating storm of hail and fire. It is a terrifying image. The sky, which should bring balance and rain, now pours down destruction. Crops are ruined, trees are shattered, and lives are affected. Here is another widely discussed detail. Some scholars see a possible chain reaction among the plagues, as if one opened the way for the next. Contaminated water, animal infestations, outbreaks of disease, the death of livestock, environmental collapse, crop destruction. But again, the force of the text is not mainly in proving a scientific mechanism. It is in showing that all this chaos seems to obey a higher order. The eighth plague brings the locusts. And this may be one of the most haunting images in the entire story because they do not arrive simply to annoy people. They arrive to consume whatever is left. Everything that survived the hail is now devoured. This carries a hard message. When pride insists on staying in place, destruction advances in layers. First you lose one thing, then another. And by the time you realize what is happening, even what remained is being taken away. Then comes the ninth plague, darkness over Egypt. A darkness so intense that the text describes it as something that could almost be felt. This was not just nighttime. It was a total blocking of light. And that detail is extraordinary when we remember that, for the Egyptians, the sun was central to their spiritual and political worldview. Light represented order, power, and continuity. When darkness covers everything, what is being shaken is not only the environment, it is Egypt's very sense of sovereignty. But nothing compares to the 10th plague, the most severe, the most painful, and the most remembered, the death of the firstborn. Here the account reaches the heart of the nation. Homes are marked by grief. The heir, the continuation of the family, the future, all of it is touched. And it is in this context that Passover is born, with the blood placed on the door frames as a sign of protection and deliverance. This is one of the most fascinating and, at the same time, one of the deepest points in the story. The same night that brought judgment for some brought freedom for others. The same night Egypt mourned was the night Israel began its journey out of slavery. Now there is one question that always comes up. Why didn't Pharaoh simply give in earlier? The strongest answer suggested by the text itself is the hardening of his heart. Pharaoh represents the kind of power that would rather watch everything collapse than admit it is not in control, and that makes the story unsettlingly relevant even today. Because the plagues of Egypt are not only about an ancient king, they are about every human heart that insists on resisting the truth, even when all the signs are right in front of it. Another important detail is that many scholars see the 10 plagues as a direct confrontation not only with Pharaoh, but with specific Egyptian gods connected to the Nile, fertility, health, the sky, light, and life. In other words, the biblical account is saying this was not merely a battle between Moses and Pharaoh. It was a battle between the God of Israel and everything Egypt treated as absolute. And maybe that is exactly where the truth lies. The great power of this narrative is not in choosing between it was supernatural or it was natural. Its power is in showing that the greatest empire of the time, with all its gods, wealth, and pride, had no power to prevent its own downfall when confronted by a greater authority. That is why this story is still alive, because it touches something universal. Every human being understands the danger of arrogance. Every society knows what happens when power becomes oppressive. And every generation understands, in one way or another, that there are moments when reality shatters the illusion of control. The 10 plagues of Egypt are remembered not only because they were terrifying, but because they reveal an uncomfortable truth. When pride refuses to listen, the cost of resistance can be devastating. And at the same time, the story also reveals another powerful truth. Deliverance can be born in the darkest night. In the end, the 10 plagues of Egypt are not just a sequence of ancient catastrophes. They are a portrait of the fall of pride, of the clash between oppression and freedom, between resistance and obedience, between human power and human limits. And maybe that is why this story never grows old. Now, I want to hear from you. Which of these plagues do you find the most striking, and why? Drop your answer in the comments, because I really want to read what you think. And if you enjoy deep, historical, biblical content full of fascinating details that help us see ancient stories in a completely new way, go ahead and hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because the next videos are going to surprise you even more.